identities of the bad actors, but we won't mirror the despicable behavior that we routinely see on the left. This program, me in particular, we've consistently condemned violence in the country. We do so again tonight. But for most of this year, you do have a media mob and Democrats making excuse after excuse and at times even flat out refusing to condemn what we saw over the summer. Violent far-left riots in cities across America. They were wrong not to condemn it. And they even were wrong to say it wasn't happening when our own eyes saw it. As people were murdered, buildings were burned to the ground, police precincts completely taken over. They did nothing. In many cases, the left even defended this activity. You might remember. Take a look.
Respectfully, should that be done by a commission or the city council, not a mob in the middle of the night throwing it into the harbor?
People will do what they do.
There's violence across the whole country. Do you disavow the violence from Antifa? That's happening in Portland right now? That's
a myth that's being spread only in Washington, D.C.
About Antifa in Portland?
Yes.
They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. And that should be, everyone should take note of that on both levels, that this isn't, they're not going to let up, and they should not.
This is a post-left protest. It is not generally speaking unruly. The fires have been started.
Perhaps this is some sort of mechanism for a restructure in our country.
Like, for example, fake news CNN reported that the scene of one of the riots, remember, take a look at that scene. Look over the shoulder of the reporter there. Look at what the banner said. Fiery, but mostly peaceful. All they had to do is turn around and look. A few years ago, Vox reported, quote, riots are destructive and dangerous and scary, but can lead to serious social reform. Today, the headline, of course, a little different because, well, yeah, they can bludgeon the president with a political issue. Quote, every person who forced their way into the Capitol should be arrested. What changed at Vox? As you can imagine, suddenly the same media mob is trying to condemn all Trump supporters. The vast majority in Washington, D.C. today were peaceful. You can't paint them with a broad brush, although you'd like to. And unlike the media mob, this program, we will be consistent. We condemn the violence over the summer. We condemn the violence at the Capitol today, and we better fix it, and we better fix it by tomorrow. And let me state the obvious for the safety of those people that work there, and law enforcement, our elected officials. The people who acted violently today, they don't represent the millions of law-abiding, hard-working, tax-paying citizens, responsible American patriots that are worried about election integrity, that have every right to express their grievances and to protest, as most did today, peacefully. Every American has that right. Now, the massive crowd that did peacefully assemble today, not the people that went into the Capitol, why do they care? Why was such a large crowd of people in Washington, D.C.? Why was that massive crowd in Washington, D.C. today? Now, does anybody in the media, anybody on the left, do they want to understand how hundreds of thousands of Americans, what motivated them to leave their homes and their towns and their cities and often fly or come long distances to be at that massive rally today? In other words, understand why they felt their need to be there today. The law-abiding citizens, very big distinction. The overwhelming, the 99%, as we say. In other words, why were the overwhelming majority of peaceful protesters in D.C.? Well, we did have thousands of, or hundreds and hundreds of affidavits signed by eyewitnesses to our election November 3rd, whistleblowers, eyewitnesses that signed sworn affidavits under penalty of perjury. Nobody that I know in the media mob, nobody on Capitol Hill that had a D in front of their name wanted to hear from any of them. Those whistleblowers were ignored. They were dismissed by Democrats, dismissed by the media. This was probably one of the few shows in America that actually gave them a platform to listen to what it is they were swearing to in a legal document. Well, they wanted they wanted their voices to be heard. And the American people were watching this and saying, why aren't you listening to the people that are making these claims? Shouldn't we be investigating? Remember, according to Democrats, whistleblowers, especially if you're an anonymous hearsay non-whistleblower, you are to be honored as brave and courageous and patriotic. Make no mistake, there were serious election irregularities. We've got to address them in state after state after state. Why? Because as a country, we can't have 83% of one party, 30% of independents not having confidence in the election result. That needs to be fixed. For example, in Georgia, we've talked at length about the lawsuit in early 2020 by Democrats, and then what I believe is an unlawful consent decree that allowed for drop boxes and allowed for two unequal standards as it relates to signature verification in place. They had a lax standard if you were a mail-in voter, which has the highest issue of fraud according to the New York Times and abuse, and they had a more strict standard for in-person voting. You know, like you had to present voter ID, and then they would check your signature with the database in the state of Georgia. We also had chain of custody issues in Georgia. In almost every one of these swing states, well, there is statutory language that allows partisan observers to watch the vote counting. In almost all of them, nobody got to watch the vote count. Well, that's what the law provides for. Some of the people that were protesting and coming from around the country, they're like, why don't we obey the law? These are the laws of the land. People are saying that they don't want people breaching the Capitol. They're right. But also, if the law is partisan observers watch the count, they need to watch it. There are also serious claims of fraud in Wisconsin. In other words, the law in Wisconsin, a place like Michigan, well, state law, well, expressly prohibits early voting. Well, how come it occurred? Well, we had a powerful dissent in that 3-4 decision. The Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court said it rather well. 4 members of this court threw the cloak over numerous problems that will be repeated again and again until the court has the courage to correct them. Another dissenting justice remarked that the state's ruling against the Trump campaign is, quote, doomed to create chaos, uncertainty, undermine confidence, and spawn needless litigation. Look at the case in Pennsylvania. We're going to stick to the law and the Constitution. State law was clearly changed by the legislature in violation of what the direct language is in the Pennsylvania Constitution. That relates to mail-in ballots. And of course, they had the artificial mail-in ballot deadline extension. That was pushed back without lawmaker approval either. Well, if they have a state constitution, you want to change it, well, you got to go through the process of doing it. Look at what the state constitution in Pennsylvania says. The legislature shall, by general law, provide in a manner which qualified electors who may be absent may vote, and for the return and canvass of their votes in the election district in which they respectfully reside. Article 2 of our Constitution also articulates the following. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. In other words, it is up to state legislatures to decide the election period, but it's got to be constitutional based on their state, or they change the Constitution. Not the governor, not the Secretary of State, not the Democratic Party. But the highest court in the land just flat out, sadly, refused to hear that case. I think they should have. The courts also refused to hear a very serious case out of Texas, backed by 17 attorneys general. Also sought a decision on election irregularities. The courts, the media, Democratic establishment, Republicans that hate Donald Trump, none of them had apparently any intellectual curiosity about any of this. They didn't care that laws were changed or laws violated or constitutions violated. They didn't seem to want to hear from what eyewitnesses had to say, hundreds of them, that signed legal affidavits. They didn't care about partisan observers not observing. They didn't want to look at actual vote count numbers from people a lot smarter than me that were able to break those down. They just didn't seem to care. They just want to say, oh, we looked into that, it's fine. Well, the people that showed up in Washington today don't feel that way. And the majority of them were peaceful. They don't want an audit. They don't really care what happened. Because why? Sadly, the ends justifies the means. They got the result that they wanted. This is why millions of Americans no longer trust the system. That's why so many people showed up in Washington today. The law-abiding, peaceful citizens that were expressing their anger and legally and rightfully their grievances and protesting peacefully. That's why they no longer trust politicians. That's why, well, nobody trusts the media mob. This is why hundreds of thousands of people did in fact show up. They are tired of being lied to. For over 5 years, they have sat back and they have watched America's most powerful institution. They lied about this president and a Russia hoax that never occurred. The media lied, conspiracy theories spread. You might say Russia-Trump hoaxers or truthers at this point. Then, of course, they had breathtaking hypocrisy on the Ukraine impeachment. In the first case, they didn't care about Russian interference because when Hillary's dirty Russian misinformation dossier hit the scene, they didn't pay any attention to it. They didn't care about the quid pro quo with Joe that he bragged about using $1 billion taxpayer dollars. Why? To protect his son making millions with no experience in a business he never worked in. They covered up the Biden family international pay-for-play scheme, or what I call the foreign syndicate of the Bidens. Even as Joe Biden caught on tape doing a lot of what I just mentioned, well, to get a prosecutor fired, he did. You got 6 hours or you're not getting the $1 billion taxpayer dollars I'm holding. Anyway, why didn't that happen? Remember Hunter's laptop filled with evidence of his family's corruption? Twitter, Facebook, they censored any and all stories about it before the election. Well, that sounds like a big problem to me. Democrats called it a conspiracy theory. Well, they pushed conspiracy theories. I guess they would know it if they saw it. You know, the laptop is now part of a real criminal federal probe into money laundering and tax evasion. So, yeah, Americans are sick and tired of being lied to and not being listened to and having the law thwarted and have unequal justice and application of our laws. They're also unhappy about the fact that there's seemingly no desire to fix an election system that clearly has problems. We know because even liberal senators said so. Even the liberal New York Times said so and other outlets. And they're not just going to blindly trust election results, especially after what we saw in nearly every battleground state. Their right to demand transparency and investigations and audits and a right to demand the truth, not to be brushed aside, oh, we looked into that when they didn't look into anything. Anyway, when you look at all the hundreds of thousands of people that showed up in Washington today, I'm not talking about those that were violent, those that rioted, those that went into the Capitol illegally, those that were acting in violent ways towards our brave men and women in law enforcement. No, people have a right to be angry, but protest peacefully. And the urgent push for election integrity will continue. Here with more from outside the U.S. Capitol, our own Kevin Corke. Kevin.